the waves of dynasty were to cover the whole country. Here in Allahabad, 500 miles east of Delhi, lived the man who would become India's first Prime Minister. Here too was born his daughter, herself to follow him as leader of the nation. The house itself, named Anand Bhavan, or House of Joy, became the epicenter of Indian nationalism. In the early 1900s, it was the house of a wealthy lawyer named Motilal Nehru. Motilal came from a family of Kashmiri Pandits, Indians of the highest caste, and advisors and courtiers to India's rulers for generations.
It used to be said that wherever he sat became the head of the table because he was such a tremendous personality, and my mother always remarked on his huge roar of laughter that would sort of set the rhythm of the household.
Motilal Nehru himself was highly westernized, and you must remember in those days, modernization, westernization, anglicization, they were all equivalent terms, because the only window we had to the outside world was through England. England for us was the world.
And it was to England that Motilal Nehru sent his only son for his education. In 1905, Jawaharlal, aged 16, enrolled at Harrow. Churchill's old school, training ground for the British Empire and its army, was an unlikely nursery for a future freedom fighter. But in those days at Harrow, and later at Cambridge University and the Inns of Court, Jawaharlal was as much a socialite as socialist. His letters home plead his own poverty from gambling debts and tailor's bills, rather than the poverty of his fellow man. And when his father needed to dress up for a special occasion, he cabled Jawaharlal,
"I have received the command of His Gracious Majesty George V to be in attendance at Delhi." A funny way of inviting a gentleman.
For Motilal, nothing but the best. Jawaharlal hurried to the king's own tailors.
I replied, "I got your cable the day before yesterday, and have ordered the court dress and the other clothes you required at Poole's. I suppose you want the ordinary levy dress with sword and everything complete?"
Thus, properly attired, Motilal was ready for the occasion. Together with other important members of the Indian elite, he attended the 1911 visit of the new king, George V, and Queen Mary on their visit to India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. Motilal was an eminent trial lawyer at the Allahabad High Court. He was highly respected and earned a fortune. His son was well placed to do even better, and in 1912, Jawaharlal returned to India, a qualified lawyer and thoroughly westernized, like his father.
I don't think anybody quite realized that Jawaharlal, by the time he came back from England, would be an Englishman in his values, in his behavior, in his manner of living, and the way he liked things done.
I think every one of them at some time or the other thought that Nehru had more than was necessary of the West in him.
However westernized, the Nehrus were still Indians at heart, and Motilal insisted on an Indian-style arranged marriage for his son. The chosen bride was Kamala, very pretty, but, alas, not as highly educated. Kamala was only 16, and Nehru 26, when the wedding took place in Delhi. Within a year of the wedding, Kamala dutifully produced a baby, a daughter, called Indira. Motilal was overjoyed with his first grandchild. But his growing family was now coming under a new influence, that of a lawyer of a very different kind from the westernized Nehrus. His name was Mohandas K. Gandhi, a leader of India's budding freedom movement. His spinning wheel became a symbol for self-sufficiency. Homespun products were to replace imports from Britain, so weakening the imperial link. Gandhi was the inspiration for oppressed people everywhere, and a guiding star for the Nehrus.
He was able to galvanize the country, make it conscious that freedom was its birthright. He felt the pulse of the country much more than Nehru did. Nehru, after all, a product of Harrow and Cambridge universities, a bit of a brown sahib, going holidays, skiing and that kind of thing. And he arrived on the scene. And I think he also sensed that if he had any future in politics, it had to be with Gandhi. He had to ride his wagon, and he could achieve his goal.
Non-violent resistance to British rule was the form of struggle initiated by Gandhi on April 6, 1919, to fight the British Empire. For the weak Indians, it was a most powerful weapon. It provided the Indian freedom fighters with the moral strength to challenge British brute power. One week after the first demonstration, General Reginald Dyer decided to teach those Indians who espoused nonviolent resistance a lesson they would not forget.
On Sunday, April 13th, Brigadier General Dyer marched with his armed force through the tortuous, torrid streets and mazy lanes of Amritsar. He ordered the troops to fire upon the seething mass of humanity gathered for a peaceful meeting.
The Amritsar massacre was to become legendary in the story of Indian nationalism. Hundreds of defenseless Indians died, unable to flee from the British bullets. For Jawaharlal, it was a watershed. He became a fervent follower of Gandhi.
The urge to go out and strike a blow for India, do something in a new way, in this non-violent way, appealed terrifically to my brother, as it must have done to a lot of other young men, and suddenly life in Anand Bhavan and all that it had meant became meaningless and in fact terribly superficial.
Both Jawaharlal and his father had played a key role in the Indian National Congress, a polite body of the anglicized Indian elite, which had no real aspirations to independence. But now, Gandhi's non-violence and Amritsar's rifles were to convert father and son into Indian freedom fighters and reclothe the Nehrus, both literally and metaphorically. They changed dramatically. They started to dress in Indian style and stopped eating Western food and even speaking English at home.
All the beautiful clothes that they all had, made by Henry Poole, the king's tailors in London, were all burnt and replaced by village-made, hand-spun, hand-woven, thick, uncomfortable khadar.
I remember him only from the time when he had joined Gandhiji, and I never saw him in Western clothes. He was always in a dhoti and kurta, and I remember him, that shawl that was always over one shoulder, making him look like a Roman senator in a toga.
Gandhi urged his followers to embrace poverty. But Jawaharlal knew nothing of this India. As part of his education, Jawaharlal set out to see what the rest of India was like outside the privileged walls of his home. He knew the facts, that India's 250 million was an uneasy mix of the fabulously wealthy and desperately poor, of many faiths and even more languages. But unlike Gandhi, he did not know the reality. What he saw would make him not only a nationalist, but also a socialist.
I was filled with shame and sorrow. Shame at my own easygoing and comfortable life. Sorrow at the degradation and overwhelming poverty of India. Their faith in us, casual visitors from the distant city, embarrassed me and filled me with a new responsibility that frightened me.
He wanted to declass himself. I mean, he could not change the diction of his English, but he could change the quality of his lifestyle, and he did it. He lived with them, he ate with them, and that is how he won their affection.
In 1921, the Prince of Wales, the future king, toured the empire to raise morale. With him came the man who would one day end British rule in India, Lord Mountbatten. It was on this trip that the young Mountbatten proposed to Edwina, who would herself, in years to come, develop an intense relationship with Jawaharlal Nehru. The Indian Maharajas, who with British approval ruled half of India, welcomed the prince and his party. But the masses of the people, following Gandhi's lead, resorted to the hartal, or total boycott.
When they arrived, the crowds were very thin and very disappointing and quite hostile. And in fact, several engagements, I think, really were cancelled.
I remember that there was a complete hartal, a complete strike in Allahabad. The streets were vacant, there were no traffic, all the shops were closed, and the Prince of Wales procession went along with nobody to see it.
Many protesters were arrested, including both Motilal and Jawaharlal. They were now in the leadership of the freedom movement and deliberately invited imprisonment by the British authorities.
Motilal tried to find out what life in jail would be all about. And he was horrified to learn that not only would his son actually have to sleep on the floor, but actually wash his own underclothes. And in his own mind, Motilal had started preparing himself for the rigors of jail by practicing sleeping on the floor in his own home.
Yet he was not prepared for 6 months of it.
For Motilal, it was a tremendous culture shock. I mean, the last thing that the best lawyer in the country wants to know is that he's going to go to jail. But, of course, being Motilal, once he had made up his mind, he sort of did it with a vengeance.
Motilal and Jawaharlal were soon visited by the 12-year-old B.K. Nehru.
The first thing I heard when we were near them was the laughter of Motilal, very loud and very peculiar laugh, recognizable by anybody because it came right from the belly. I heard his laughter. So I realized that he really couldn't have been tortured or ill-treated or anything. He must be all right.
A few years later, in 1929, the Indian National Congress met in Lahore with Motilal, now a national hero, at its head. Gandhi put his immense prestige behind the election of Jawaharlal Nehru as the new Congress president for that year. It was a defining moment for the freedom movement and for the man. Now, for the first time, Nehru called for total independence for India and for an open revolt against British rule.
What struck me and people like me, the younger generation, more than anything else, was his statement, "We are out in an open conspiracy against British rule." This was a frank statement. It was a conspiracy, but an open conspiracy, open struggle.
It meant leadership of a new generation coming into its own against the older generation. Jawaharlal Nehru represented the youth of the country.
4 weeks after the Lahore Congress, on January 26, 1930, Gandhi called for a nationwide pledge to join Nehru's open conspiracy.
My mother had told me that at this very moment, everybody in India would be saying the same thing. That gave us a tremendous sense of, what shall I say, unity, satisfaction, glory, greatness. We felt that we are really doing something very, very important. I shall never forget the 26th January 1930.
Few expected to see it, but complete independence was now the declared goal, and millions joined the struggle. That year, Gandhi led his Salt March, challenging the British right to tax salt. Following Gandhi's lead, Indians everywhere made salt without paying tax, demonstrably breaking one more British law.
Hundreds and thousands of people who were there, and fires were lit, and we went in, took seawater in the earthen vessels and brought the vessels and put them on fire. And after some time, the water evaporated and some black substance, that was salt. So we had broken the law.
The British responded with determination, zealously confronting each and every protest, however non-violent. Thousands were imprisoned. Jawaharlal himself spent most of the early 1930s in jail. The frequent arrests were memorable to Nehru's young niece.
Departures for jail were always an occasion of excitement. It was not going to jail, what a terrible thing. You were brought up to feel that going to jail was something wonderful, that we were doing it for a goal, a very special reason, and that you had to go with a glad heart. And in fact, they did go with glad hearts, the ones in our family that we, as children, that we saw going off to jail, uncle, father, mother, grandmother, everybody.
Jawaharlal was to spend nearly 10 of his best years under British lock and key. Comforts were few, but as a privileged political prisoner, he had access to pen and paper. Lengthy volumes and endless letters poured forth, such as this to his daughter Indira on her 13th birthday.
A time comes when, for a great cause, even simple, ordinary men and women become heroes. Great leaders have something in them which inspires a whole people and makes them do great deeds.
Jawaharlal was writing of Gandhi, but Indira must surely have seen her own father in his words.
The highlight of those days were interview days, which came once a fortnight, 20 minutes. And I found my father always cheerful. I don't know how he was feeling inside, but the interview days meant so much to him that he made a special effort to tell us amusing things that had happened.
But the frequent imprisonments took their toll on the 70-year-old Motilal. In February 1931, he fell fatally ill. The British allowed Jawaharlal out of prison to attend the deathbed.
There he sat like an old lion mortally wounded, with his physical strength almost gone. Suddenly I noticed that his face grew calm, and the sense of struggle vanished from it. I thought he had fallen asleep, but that sleep was his last. and from it there was no awakening.
Jawaharlal was broken because even though he might have tried to break away from him, and he was very dependent on him.
The new head of the Nehru dynasty was dealt another blow when his wife, Kamala, was struck down by tuberculosis. But it did not curb her determination.
I think he grew fondest of his wife when she joined him on the streets in the early 30s, in that movement. And he discovered a great love for her because he knew that she was doing it for him.
In 1936, the ailing Kamala died. In the following years, Nehru and his daughter Indira would grow closer. And increasingly, the caring company of other women became important to Jawaharlal.
Very important. And I think that is true of many of the freedom fighters. Because after all, when you take the youth of a person, put him into jail, when he does come out, he starts seeing the world anew. He was himself an extraordinarily handsome person, very intelligent, a caring person in his own way when he wanted to be caring. And he had many women friends.
Jawaharlal's reputation as a left-wing leader was growing both at home and abroad. In 1938, Nehru traveled to Europe, visiting fellow socialists, the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War, and the Czech leaders at the time of the Munich crisis. He visited Germany and observed Europe marching inexorably toward war. In his own mind, Nehru put himself squarely on the side of the anti-fascists. But his primary concern was the fate of India. When war did break out in 1939, India felt far away from trouble. The British Viceroy ordered full-blown ceremonial grandeur for his daughter's wedding in New Delhi. But within 2 years, war was approaching India's border.
To the complacency of the colonial British, there came an abrupt and shocking end in December 1941. The conquering hordes of Japan, sweeping triumphantly through the Far East, shattered among the people of India and the Orient the pattern of European supremacy. Out of the smashing and humiliating defeats Japan inflicted upon those who had so long been masters, came a new conception of Asia for Asiatics, and an illusory promise of a future from which Europeans would be excluded.
The British wanted Indian support in the war. Nehru was willing to help fight the fascists, but Gandhi did not want to help the British.
Gandhi said that we would happily support the British, but we would only do it as a free country, not as a subservient country. Jawaharlal, it is not known, actually tried very hard to persuade Gandhi to support the British war effort.
Nehru would bow to Gandhi's will and publicly urged non-cooperation in the war effort. His speeches secured him his 8th jail sentence and raised anxieties with the Allies.
The United States entered the war with Pearl Harbor, December 1941. And in early 1942, they were very concerned about mobilizing the alliance and trying to get more out of India. More arms production, more defense production, and mobilizing the country, which was seen as a potential great resource for the Allies.
Very suddenly, India became the key area for the conduct of operations in China, since the Japanese had cut off the coastal approaches to China. And we had very quickly, from the beginning of 1942, 250,000 American military personnel in India.
And today, other young men from Georgia and Oregon, Vermont and California are journeying across 12,000 miles of perilous seas, for the war which has encompassed the earth has made faraway India a vital frontier.
It was an extraordinary impact, and ordinary Americans in large numbers, for the very first time, got some sense of what India was, where it was, who the Indians were.
In 1942, Sir Stafford Cripps arrived in India. His near impossible brief from Winston Churchill was to keep India loyal during the war, without promising much about independence once the war was over.
The clock of destiny is ticking away, and war and danger hover over the world. We shall have to face their consequences also, and we can only face them by forgetting our petty troubles and conflicts and pulling all together.
The United States' help in the negotiations was insufficient to bridge the gap.
There was a U.S. desire for India to be independent, but not at the price of rupturing the alliance. Winning the war, maintaining the alliance with Britain was ultimately more important for the United States than pressing the British beyond the breaking point for Indian independence.
Gandhi considered the British offers inadequate. He called the Cripps mission a post-dated check on a failing bank, and escalated the freedom struggle by launching the Quit India movement even as the war continued. Demonstrations against the British engulfed India.
Gandhi then came to the view that Indian people are getting demoralized. So he wanted to initiate a struggle. Nehru, on the other hand, was not in favor. But in the end, he agreed with Gandhi, and enthusiastically agreed with Gandhi for Quit India because of this other argument that not to struggle means to demoralize the Indian people, that we are helpless and we can't do anything.
The British immediately arrested Gandhi. And in Allahabad, they arrested Nehru and several members of his family, including his niece.
I was just 18 years old then. And earlier in the year, when I had my 18th birthday party, that was supposed to be my coming of age. But actually my coming of age was 30th of August when I was taken to jail.
Even as the struggle for independence in India continued, there was euphoria over victory in Europe.
Yes, VE Day was here at last. Costumes and decorations mingled with the uniforms of those who'd fought in the battle for freedom in one giant kaleidoscope of color.
The Indian troops, mostly Muslim, who did fight with the British, marched too.
Another great cheer greeted the forces of India, whose magnificent fighting record is now saluted by Britain and her people. The men for whom this triumphal march was a fulfillment of all their hard-won victories.
The Indian soldiers who fought for freedom and democracy all over the world were yet to get freedom and democracy at home. But the war did herald the end game for British India. A month after the ceasefire, the British government called a conference in Simla, the summer capital of India, to start the discussions for an end to British rule. Nehru and Gandhi were inevitably out of touch. It had been Nehru's longest prison term of all, and Gandhi had been released only because he was seriously ill.
My talk with Nehru at that time was in Simla, And it was the first time I had seen him since early in the war, because he'd been in prison. He had very recently been released. My sense was that since being released, he really hadn't caught up with the realities of the situation. I thought two things had happened during the war. One, that the cost of the war on Britain had greatly weakened Britain's capacity to return to its pre-war status. And two, that during the war and even before, the Muslim movement, the Muslim League movement, had become much less an elitist small group and much more a mass group.
The Muslim League had joined the British in the war effort. Its leader was Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Now he expected his reward, a separate state called Pakistan in the Muslim-majority areas of India. This meant a whole new reality. It was now Jinnah, once an anglicized lawyer like Nehru, who was to be Nehru's principal adversary in negotiating for independence. It made the discussion slow and laborious. With little to report on the inconclusive conference, the young journalist Khushwant Singh left Simla by the last rail car of the day.
As we were coming down the hill, the radio was on, and the British elections results were announced, and the Labour Party had won the election. Now, there were only 2 Indians in that rail car, and as soon as they said the Labour Party had won a landslide victory, we both got up and yelled and almost embraced each other, because we realized that the Labour Party in power in England would mean that independence to India was round the corner.
The newly elected government recognized that Britain would have to grant freedom to India. Lord Mountbatten, the supreme Allied commander Southeast Asia, would oversee the handover. As luck would have it, he had already met his counterpart in Malaya.
Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru flew to Singapore, the first stop in his lightning tour of Malaya. He was received by Major General Kimmins on behalf of Admiral Mountbatten.
Panditji had come out to see the Indian community in Malaya, and in those days was considered a very dubious figure as this freedom fighter.
The British authorities had decreed that he should be given no recognition and no help whatsoever. And my father said, this is absolute nonsense. We have to deal now with a post-war situation. This man is going to be the Prime Minister of India one day, and we have to have a good relationship.
When he arrived at the airfield at Singapore, he drove straight to Government House, where I had a preliminary talk with him. And then I drove him on in my own open car as far as the Indian soldiers' canteen where my wife was working.
Everybody outside tried to race to the doorway to get in. So there was again a sea of humanity pushing and shoving. And one of the first victims was my mother, who was knocked sideways and then actually I think crawled under a table, thinking, you know, from wartime practice and avoiding bombs and things, get under the kitchen table used to be the answer. So under a table she went. And so she found that eventually she emerged from the table to find Pandit Nehru helping her to her feet, and that was how they met.
It was to prove a fateful meeting, the first step in what was to become a grand affair of the heart.
We liked him enormously. The atmosphere was very happy, and we couldn't help feeling that in that atmosphere he probably liked us a bit too.
In March 1947, Mountbatten, now the Viceroy, arrived in India with a plan to hand over power in just 1 year. Nehru had the advantage over other Indian leaders, thanks to his earlier meeting with the Mountbattens in Singapore. Now, Nehru became a frequent guest of the Viceroys.
I remember very early on when we were up in Simla, I was sent into his room with a message. I suppose I must have knocked at his door, which is the kind of thing he would be very impatient with. Come in, come in, come in, you know. So I sort of burst in and found the Prime Minister of India standing on his head, because he used to do yoga every morning. And so I suppose I looked, you know, oh, come on, don't be silly, what do you want to say? So we had a long conversation with him standing on his head.
While Nehru was at Simla, the latest British plan, offering independence to an Indian federation of Hindu and Muslim states, was already in London for cabinet approval. But Nehru had not seen the details. On a sudden hunch, Mountbatten showed him a draft.
This is something I couldn't possibly have done, except on the basis of a complete mutual trust. Nehru turned the new draft down flat. He said it would lead to the balkanization of India, and he would have nothing to do with it, and he doubted if any party would.
It was a great disappointment, of course, great disappointment. And I think that our reaction was, well, he's done his best, but he'll have to try again.
Next, Mountbatten offered straight partition rather than federation as the only option. But he still had to get the consent of Jinnah, the Muslim leader, for what the Muslims were already calling a moth-eaten Pakistan. And Jinnah was known, above all, for using one small word.
In dealing with Jinnah, Mountbatten had a problem, because Jinnah had reached the position of power that he had got by what I call exercising the veto.
It was always a question of no. I mean, no was the answer that came most frequently to his lips.
Oh no, said Jinnah, we must have Pakistan. And so it went on, a circular argument, round and round the mulberry bush. I never met anybody who could say no so persistently and so effectively.
I remember Mountbatten telling me that the only person he'd not been able to persuade to budge an inch was Mr. Jinnah.
Finally, on June 3rd, 1947, a breakthrough.
Momentous days as the Viceroy holds vital talks with the leaders to discuss the transfer of power to Indian hands. Early on the scene is Mr. Jinnah, leader of the Muslim League. As the thermometer blazes up to 112 degrees outside, water is sprayed upon the door curtain to keep the inner temperature down. Pandit Nehru and other delegates have a short word with Viscount Mountbatten before the talks begin.
That day, they reached an agreement. Jinnah consented to the division that would separate India from future Pakistan. Nehru congratulated all participants.
We are little men serving great causes, but because the cause is great, something of that greatness falls upon us also, and I have no doubt that we are ushering in a period of greatness for India.
The next day, Mountbatten called a press conference and sprung a surprise on both the negotiators and the press.
In the course of the hundreds or so questions that were asked, somebody asked, when do you think the transfer of power will take place? And Mountbatten observed that he thought it would be sometime in August.
The implications were tremendous. At one word from Mountbatten, India, a fifth of mankind, would be divided into two independent states, not in a year's time, but in just a few weeks. The partition of India was a high price to pay. Gandhi had anointed Nehru as first Prime Minister of independent India. But the Mahatma would have nothing to do with partition and stayed away from Delhi on Independence Day.
Gandhi, to begin with, said over his dead body, and it may not have been over his dead body, but it was certainly over his broken heart. Nobody wanted the division of India.
But division it had to be. On the appointed day, August 14th, 1947, Jinnah got his Pakistan. He had only a year to live as its leader. As for Nehru, he was India's undisputed leader. But partition would sour the sweet taste of freedom.
The finest aspect of Jawaharlal was the intensity with which he felt the other's pain, particularly the pain of the innocent. He knew that partition would entail a pain of a kind India had never experienced before.
Nehru knew what the millions flooding into Delhi to celebrate did not. That violence between Muslim and Hindu was already tarnishing the brilliance of the hour of liberation, set for midnight on August 14th.
That night I went to Parliament House. We were there till midnight in a milling crowd. And then at midnight this hushed silence. Then Nehru's very famous speech, Tryst with Destiny. It was a very electrifying experience.
Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
The main emotion of the day was an intense and widespread joy and a belief that at last, after all these centuries and centuries of rule by Muslims and British, India was independent.
The thrill of independence, that we were at last free, was so strong, so powerful, that it was indescribable.
Freedom had been the star that guided my parents. You know, it was like the Magi going towards the birth of Christ, or like Galahad and the Grail. I mean, we saw it in the most romantic terms.
The independence of India bade farewell to Nehru's role as heroic freedom fighter. But the sea of problems which was to beset him as Prime Minister was already engulfing him. Independence brought Nehru to power, but he had no power to control the huge upheavals it triggered.
Whole humanity was on the road. We couldn't imagine so many people. Somebody said, my father has been killed, my mother has been killed, so many. All stories were really harrowing kind of thing.
India had been divided and exploded into sectarian hatred. Across northern India, people abandoned their homes to escape violence. The new state of Pakistan had been carved out of two areas where Muslims were a majority. Nehru worked with frenetic energy for refugees. Careless of his own safety, he would break up violence himself when he saw Muslims attacked.
Nehru rushing with his just small baton and said, get out, get out, get out, this is not done. I mean, the people did tell him that, look here, how can the Prime Minister do this kind of thing? But I remember him, very human.
I remember one night in Amritsar station at midnight, a train was coming in from Lahore, which is only 30 miles or so away. It had been stopped 3 times before it crossed the frontier. And whereas I was an observer and not participating, obviously everybody who was there had to help. And we took out maybe 24 bodies and nearly 100 people who had been slashed with either swords or agricultural implements or whatever.
Several trains bringing back Muslims from India and shifting to Pakistan. They were cut up in Patiala and Amritsar, the two 6 strongholds. And just bodies were sent to us, with women having suckling babies and laws going right through them.
Nowhere was the violence more intense than in Punjab, an area with a large Sikh population among the Hindus and Muslims. It had been cut in two by the new border between India and Pakistan. In fear for their lives, Hindus and Sikhs fled Pakistan as Muslims struggled to reach their new homeland. Massacres on both sides inflamed what became the largest migration in human history. 14 million moved. Countless thousands were killed. Some just died.
A train bringing some Muslims came into Pakistan and shouted, Allahu Akbar. God is great. And at that very moment, a woman, old woman of 70 or 75, who was carrying herself with great difficulty walking, asked me, "Sir, have I reached Pakistan?" And I said, "Yes, mother, you have." And she sat down, said kalima, and died on the spot.
Pandit Nehru never imagined a situation like this would come about. In fact, I don't think he had planned for this at all. What he thought was, once partition was agreed to, both the countries will settle down in their work. But it was not so. And he was very depressed in those days to see the suffering of the people.
While Nehru struggled with the birth pains of the new Indian nation, an old India still survived.
More than 500 native Indian princes, whose realms include states varying in size from a few villages to thousands of square miles, today retain their thrones only through treaty agreements with the British. In the hands of a few of these rulers are concentrated some of the world's most enormous private fortunes.
The princes had accepted British rule. In exchange, they'd kept their royal status, their wealth, and their private armies. So when the last British viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, negotiated Indian independence, the princes weren't included, and their future remained undecided. These princely states pockmarked the map of the subcontinent. The largest was the size of Texas. Some were a few square miles. Most of the princes joined India in exchange for a handsome pension from the government. But Kashmir bordered India and Pakistan. Both wanted it, and the conflict plunged Nehru into his second crisis within weeks of independence. The ruler was a Hindu Maharaja, but his subjects were Hindus, Buddhists, and Muslims, with the Muslims in a majority. Nehru wanted Kashmir to prove that India was a safe home for all religions, including Muslims. Paradoxically, Kashmir's most popular Muslim leader and Nehru's close friend, Sheikh Abdullah, also wanted Kashmir to join India.
It was the leader of the Kashmiri Muslims who did not want to go to Pakistan. If Sheikh Abdullah had wanted to go to Pakistan, I mean, the matter would have been closed right then. And that was why the Indian claim had its moral legitimacy rather than just the legal legitimacy.
Sheikh Abdullah's support for India was a blow to Pakistan's ambitions. Pakistan's leader, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, now feared he might lose Kashmir and decided to force the pace of events.
He called me. He said, Shaukat, what can we do? I said, sir, the only way to stop this thing happening is to walk into Kashmir. He said, I don't want to involve my army, and in any case, my army, the 3 battalions, are completely involved in carrying Muslims out. So we have got no force to fight with. I said, sir, I will arrange the force. And he said, yes, go ahead, you do that.
Several thousand Muslim tribesmen were thus encouraged to invade Kashmir from Pakistan. However, reluctantly, Nehru was forced to act.
Nehru talked. He had a large perspective on life. He talked about the United Nations. He talked about America. He talked about Russia. He talked about everything. Until Sardar Patel said, do we want Kashmir or we don't? And he said, of course we want Kashmir. So he said, will you give your orders? And he turned around to me, he said, you have received your orders.
Indian troops drove the tribesmen back, but Pakistan held on to a section of Kashmir. The Maharaja joined Nehru at the airport for a victory visit. In the war of words that followed, India and Pakistan accused each other of illegal occupation. Nehru never accepted the UN's proposals for a plebiscite, and the dispute has warped the relations between India and Pakistan ever since. Meanwhile, in Delhi, Nehru faced a new upsurge of sectarian violence. He turned to his spiritual and political mentor, Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi held no office, but he was revered as the father of India's independence. He announced a fast to the death unless violence ended, and within days, calm had been restored. But Hindu extremists and many refugees from Pakistan believed Gandhi was sympathetic to Muslims and blamed him for partition. 2 days after his fast ended, a bomb exploded at one of his prayer meetings. No one was injured, but 10 days later, a Hindu extremist tried again, with a gun.
The light has gone out of our lives, and there is darkness everywhere. Our beloved leader, Bapu as we called him, the father of the nation, is no more.
And Panditji was really crying, and I could see him in tears, see his agony. He was talking, but still not really there, as if suddenly everything is gone from the life, that kind of thing, that helplessness.
We started by going up into the roof of Viceroy's house, and you could see a mile down what was called King's Way in those days, which was the route the procession was going to take. And it was an extraordinary sight. Beer sort of totally disappeared under a sea of people surrounding it. It was essentially really a people's funeral, so to speak.
Nehru wept and sobbed and decided that his master was gone, his father was gone, his political patron was gone. He would therefore, for the rest of his prime ministership, he would try and follow Gandhi's teachings. But Nehru felt greatly lost and very much alone in that period of January 48.
Gandhi was irreplaceable. But Nehru was to find a new happiness in an unexpected quarter. Edwina Mountbatten played an active role as the Viceroy's wife, and later working with refugees. Both she and Mountbatten admired Nehru. But during their last weeks in India, an unexpected relationship blossomed between the wife of the last Viceroy and the first Prime Minister of India.
And Mr. Nehru was rather a lonely man. His wife had died many years before. And my mother was somebody who'd not been able really to communicate or make easy relationships with anybody, even with her own husband. And I think the fact that these two had similar lacks in their lives, which the other person fulfilled, gave them a very strong relationship to each other. I'm quite sure that it didn't go beyond that.
No sooner had Nehru and Edwina realized the strength of their affection than they were separated by the Governor-General's departure from India in June 1948. But there was already gossip about their liaison.
When this whole story about an affair between them became the talk of the town, as it were, a lady from the Washington Post came out here to see my mother to ask her whether, in her opinion, her brother had had an affair with Lady Mountbatten. And she posed this question with great hesitation, you know, so as not to be indelicate. So my mother sort of gave a long sigh and said, "I certainly hope so." Because I think, you know, it was just what he needed at the time, and I hope that they had an affair and were very happy together.
My father very much respected their friendship and trusted them. I think occasionally when she went out on a tour and was going to be stopping off in India, he would rather prudently say, maybe you shouldn't go to some of Panditji's public things and be photographed the whole time. You know, you ought to be a little bit discreet because maybe the papers would read far too much into that.
Edwina traveled widely for the Red Cross and visited India most years. Whenever he could, Nehru stayed with the Mountbattens when he visited Britain. Between these trips they wrote to each other, a correspondence that lasted the rest of their lives. When Edwina died during a visit to Singapore in 1960, she had with her a bundle of Nehru's letters. After independence, Nehru moved into the former residence of the British Army Commander-in-Chief. With him went the other woman in his life, his daughter Indira. There she played hostess to foreign visitors, like Eleanor Roosevelt, and acquired much political polish. But Indira had a husband. Feroz Gandhi, no relation of the Mahatma, had been a newspaper publisher living and working in Lucknow. The first years of the marriage had been happy enough, and a son and heir, Rajiv, was born in 1944. But by Sanjay's birth, 2 years later, Indira was already spending time with her father. Feroz became resentful, and the family grew apart as his wife and his 2 sons spent most of their time with Nehru, far away from him.
Indira felt it was her duty to be at her father's side in Delhi, and Feroz felt spurned by this choice because he was a visitor to the house where his wife lived. and where his 2 children were with her. He went in and out like a stranger, and they were very bad years, I think, for both of them.
This was Nehru's official residence. From here the state was run, and the policies that would guide the country's economy and foreign relations were formulated. Already 58 at independence, he took on a burden of work that would have overwhelmed many younger men. 3 private secretaries had to work in tandem to keep up with their taskmaster. One of them was N.K. Session.
He used to come out here about 8 o'clock in my office, and Panditji would have already gone to the study, signed his papers, and gone to breakfast.
Even as he lived in comfort, he worked hard at his primary task, to reduce the misery and poverty of India.
He meets crowds of people who come in the front lawn. Anybody could come in and give the petitions to him, which he used to do for about half an hour, 45 minutes. Then he used to go to the South Block office. Then he came back at about 7. It goes on except for a break for dinner. And if there is a dinner engagement with foreign guests or others present, then you are delayed. And then it goes on till about 3 a.m. Early morning he is up again.
In spite of his Brahmin upbringing, Nehru was a socialist at heart. Many of his economic policies were inspired by those of the Soviet Union.
It's quite often forgotten that the Indian independence movement was an economic more than a political struggle. Famine really was one of his most basic obsessions. Freedom meant nothing to the poor of India if it did not mean food, if it did not mean shelter.
Nehru needed aid. In 1949, the road to economic development and socialism led him to the world's richest nation, the bastion of capitalism.
Jawaharlal Nehru, Prime Minister of India and the Orient's greatest political and spiritual leader, flies to Washington on one of the most important state visits of recent years.
The 2 countries had different agendas. America wanted India's support in the Cold War. India wanted economic aid with no strings attached.
The visit was a greatly heralded visit. It was seen as a very important event. It didn't go well. And I think in part it didn't go well because of the clash of personalities. Here you had, as the American president, homespun, Middle Westerner Harry Truman, not given to philosophizing. And here you had Pandit Nehru, rather English in his manners, Edwardian in his outlook perhaps, and they simply didn't hit it off.
His way of looking at the United States was then that they were just a country of upstarts who had a lot of money. They had no manners, they had no behavior, they had no knowledge, they had no culture.
Feeling this way made it hard for Nehru to ask for help. However desperately India needed it.
Some of us who were aware of conditions in India knew that what he needed was a lot of aid quickly, because India was in real trouble both with respect to food and other shortages. He was, of course, exceedingly reluctant to ask specifically, and he took the line which was that the Americans should know our needs because they have people there.
The great democracy of the United States of America will, I feel sure, understand and appreciate our approach to life's problems, because it could not have any other aim or a different ideal.
Truman would eventually secure $150 million for India. But Nehru's sympathies remained with the left. However great the aid, no great friendship resulted.
He did make a comment toward the end of the visit saying, The United States is a great country, no doubt, but no one should ever have to visit it for the first time.
Back in India, Nehru drove home his political strength and moral authority as he prepared the country and the Congress Party for India's first general election. It was to be the largest free democratic election the world had ever seen. 17,000 candidates competed for 489 seats. In the process, Nehru left his mark on both party and country. He pressed ahead with his ambition to modernize India and give it an industrial base. Nehru himself headed the National Planning Committee, modeled after the Soviet Central Planning Office. The committee set targets for rapid development, inadvertently creating a huge and oppressive governmental bureaucracy.
When I was first there in the 1950s, I had a good American liberal commitment to what the Indians were trying to do, that old notion of a planned development. I gradually came to the view that the economic planning involved too many permissions, too much control, and also created an unfortunate industry on the part of the Indian civil service, the Indian public servants, in selling permissions.
The bureaucracy would stifle small enterprises, but large state works took off. Dams would provide irrigation to increase arable land and food production. Modernization, Nehru thought, was the principal way to stop famine. He also wanted to build steel mills and cement factories, but Western investment was slow in coming, fearing state control.
He kept inviting Western investment. The Western investment didn't come. It was only when the Russians gave India what it desperately wanted, a steel mill, that the Westerners decided that they'd made a mistake.
Nehru wanted to imitate the rapid industrialization Moscow had achieved. With one 5-year plan for India underway, and his second already in view, he was keen to study Soviet planning methods. In 1955, Nehru took the chance to strengthen personal as well as economic links with the Soviet leadership. Indira, as always, was by his side.
The visit was the most fantastic thing ever happened. We could go to their atomic energy plants, we went to their steel plants, we went to all over the place, entire Soviet Union. We went to Siberia, Tashkent, Samarkand, all these places, and everywhere we had an excellent tour.
The Soviet leaders paid a return visit to India the same year. They were amazed at the rapturous reception they received. It was a colorful demonstration of Nehru's intention to have friendly relations with the Soviet Union, regardless of his standing with the West. Nehru was also a great admirer of the Chinese Revolution and of its leader, Mao Zedong. He hoped that China and India, the most populous countries in the world, could share in the leadership of Asia, providing a counterpoint to both superpowers. Contrary to American wishes, he supported Communist China's acceptance into the UN.
It seems to me completely opposed to the very conception of the United Nations, China not being in it, for instance.
Not a question of liking China, the Chinese people's government or not. It's a question of recognizing fact and reality. If you don't, well, it's the United Nations that suffers, not China very much.
Earlier, when China invaded his northern neighbor, Tibet, Nehru had refrained from criticizing Mao. But his acceptance of China's use of force to challenge borders was to come back to haunt him. But in the meantime, Nehru wanted Mao as a principal partner as he developed the framework for the non-aligned bloc of countries. Countries non-aligned with either the US or the Soviet Union. Nehru wanted to create a real third force in a world split by the Cold War. He wanted a regular forum for the so-called non-aligned leaders. In 1955, many delegates gathered in Burma before going on to Bandung in Indonesia. It was at the time of the festival of Holi, and for President Nasser of Egypt, it showed Nehru in a new light. Nehru's nephew was with them.
It's an extraordinary thing that Jawaharlal, the man so elegant and so fastidious in other matters, just liked to be rowdy in the Holi festival. And he got fed up with this repetitive and very elegant way of sprinkling water on each other. And he said, I want to show you how we play Holi in India. Nasser had a huge Arab delegation with him. And Jawaharlal got buckets of water, and then he took the whole bucket and dropped it on Nasser's head. Wetted him, and everybody, then these prime ministers and presidents started being rowdy with each other.
Bandung demonstrated Nehru's influence among a new generation of leaders. His vision had created a movement for newly independent countries which wasn't dominated by the old colonial powers or the Cold War. For Nasser of Egypt, Tito of Yugoslavia, and many other leaders from Asia and Africa, the meetings were a symbol of their freedom from the old masters.
Non-alignment was the notion that you separated yourself off from the imperial influences of either the Soviet Union or the United States, that both, being great powers, conveyed the threat of neo-imperialism. And this brought a substantial group of countries in to the Nehru context.
Although non-aligned countries were supposed to be in between the two superpowers, but in actual fact, for instance at the UN, it turned out that on most of the issues which came up, the non-aligned countries and the Soviet Union took the same stand.
This was not appreciated in the West. In 1956, Nehru's reputation as a non-aligned leader was tarnished. He reacted very differently to simultaneous invasions in Hungary and Egypt. In Egypt, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain and France went to war to recover control.
Prime Minister Nehru was trying to soften the attitude of the British and the French by writing to the prime ministers, and then there was no way for him to side with either the British or the French in this matter. So he sided with Nasser.
At the UN, Nehru's close friend and India's ambassador, Krishna Menon, gave a fiery rendering of Nehru's opposition.
Neither the United Kingdom nor France had the right to use arms against Egypt because they were not attacked. There is nothing in the Charter, nothing in any moral principles of international law and practice which places upon any country, however great, however mighty, however steeped in the traditions of the domination by force, that today justifies their walking into another country and say, we shall make you keep the law. That is the function of the international community.
At the height of the Suez crisis, Soviet tanks took to the streets in Budapest to put down a popular uprising against Soviet dominance in Hungary. India had denounced the Suez invasion, but Nehru was reluctant to criticize Russia.
Why, sir, were you so slow in condemning Russian intrusion in Hungary?
Well, I think right at the beginning he stated, and he went on repeating two things. One was that foreign forces should be withdrawn from Hungary, and secondly, that the people of Hungary should decide their future. That we said right along. As regards other matters, we wanted to be two things. First, to be sure of our facts. Secondly, something which we always have in mind is not merely to condemn anybody, but try as far as possible to be constructive and not merely say something which might satisfy our minds but doesn't help. We want to be helpful as far as possible in our small way in the solution of problems.
Throughout this period, Indira was becoming indispensable to Nehru, and her power within the Congress Party grew. In 1959, she was elected the party president. Feroz was now a Congress MP, with a reputation for exposing corruption. He opposed Indira constantly, and tried unsuccessfully to rally government ministers against her. The estrangement between husband and wife grew.
A veritable sea of trouble is engulfing me. On the domestic front, Feroz has always resented my very existence. But since I have become president, he exudes such hostility that it seems to poison the air.
Despite the bitterness between them, Indira was devastated when Feroz died of a heart attack the following year.
The grief, or rather the missing him, is a veil surrounding me and covering me from all sides. I feel as if my luck has run out and have no confidence in myself.
Indira had lost her husband, and her father was aging. She'd made her mark on the party, but Nehru had no plans to bring her into government. There was no obvious heir as leader. For years, Nehru alone had led India, and now the pressure of office was taking its toll.
He became Prime Minister when he was 58. 12 years had passed. And he was still working 14 to 15 hours a day, writing tens of thousands of words each day, addressing meetings, presiding over the government party affairs. So the strain was bound to show.
In 1961, Nehru took what was to be his last trip to the U.S. to meet President Kennedy.
The White House is the scene of some of the most important talks the President has ever held with a foreign leader, those with Prime Minister Nehru of India.
Kennedy expected a fruitful relationship. He had been interested in India. He was interested in the nationalist movements around the world. He felt that these were emerging nations with a significant future. I think he didn't perceive that there should be any great difficulty.
Kennedy hoped to convert Nehru into an ally of the United States over Vietnam. He even pledged $1 billion of aid to India, but he couldn't engage Nehru.
Nehru had a wonderful capacity in conversation, simply to ignore the question and not respond. And then you would ask the question again, and he would not respond. And Kennedy didn't know quite how to handle it.
When they sat down and talked, Kennedy deferred to Nehru. He said, "Mr. Prime Minister, advise me how we should deal with the problem of Vietnam." And Nehru remained silent. And Kennedy came back to this issue again. And Nehru remained silent. And he came back to it again. And he could never get Nehru to talk about the issue. And Nehru had one of his moody silences. And indeed, it was said that the only time his eyes lit up was when Jackie Kennedy came in the room.
Nehru's failure to create a rapport was partially patched up when Jackie Kennedy made a visit to India, organized by Ambassador Galbraith.
We had rented a house for her. Nehru didn't think the house was adequate and moved her to the Prime Minister's residence. It was a wonderfully successful visit, both in social terms, I don't minimize that, but also in the relationship between the two countries.
Jackie Kennedy's visit was timely. Nehru was soon forced to ask America for help against China, as events on India's northern border turned his world upside down. For years, Nehru had hoped for an Indo-Chinese partnership. When in 1962, China invaded India's northern border, Nehru's worldview collapsed.
I'm afraid their thinking is a little beyond me. They say things which are so manifestly wrong. They go on talking of the McMahon line. They go on saying that we are attacking them on their territory. Everything that they occupy becomes their territory.
Nehru had been encouraged by Krishna Menon, now his defense minister, to think that the Chinese would never launch a serious attack.
It was just impossible to get him to disagree with Krishna Menon. So that when Krishna Menon told him that there was no danger and that the army was quite prepared to handle the Chinese, he took it for granted.
But the Indian border forces were no match for the Chinese, and Nehru, so disdainful of the U.S. in the past, was now forced to run begging for America's help.
It was a day of panic. And in that moment, when it looked like the sky was falling in, Nehru sent off 2 letters to Kennedy. One of the letters asked for a number of squadrons of American fighter aircraft to come in and attack the Chinese, bomb the Chinese positions in Tibet. And the second letter asked for American bombers to come in with American pilots. In effect, he asked for American military intervention.
But the intervention became unnecessary. The Chinese suddenly declared a ceasefire and simply abandoned the thousands of square miles they had captured. Mao had proved China's superiority and destroyed Nehru's vision of India and China as the twin pillars of Asia.
He is completely shattered. And after that, he was a different Pandit Nehru, totally different Pandit Nehru. He had no interest in life. Anything before him, he did not take much interest at all, just carrying on. And I don't think he recovered from it, really.
It was sad, sad, sad. And so it became clear to us that he was not really functioning. And it was sad to see him after having initially seen this vibrant 50-year-old who really carried the nationalist movement of India pretty much on his shoulders along with Gandhi. So the contrast was great.
On May 27th, 1964, in Delhi, Nehru held a cabinet meeting. Later, he dictated as usual to his secretaries before retiring.
On that day, I got a call from Mrs. Gandhi. Papu is very seriously ill. You better come here immediately and get hold of Colonel Rao, doctors and things like that. So I rushed here. Then they found out that he had a rupture of an artery. They decided to operate upon him, later gave it up and said that no, it won't do any good, and allowed to die. He died, I think, in 138 or 130.
In his diary, Nehru had copied out a favorite poem by Robert Frost. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Nehru was mourned as a national hero. He had led the struggle for independence and created the foundation for the modern Indian state in 17 unbroken years as Prime Minister. Already a widow, Indira had now lost her father and her power base. Even as she led the family in mourning, she could not know that her fate and the fate of her children was to be entwined with India's for a quarter of a century.